Well, you'll all be very relieved that I've been around long enough to know that if I'm billed for a keynote speech at 5:30, you don't do it. You just don't do it. So the remarks that I'm about to make are really those that I've drawn from listening to this very interesting day. And, I've learned a lot, and I was reflecting listening that really things have changed over the last 40 years or so since I began to be in this game. And I recall two issues which really woke me up on that. First was Alex's comments on consular affairs. Everything now is driven by this enormous impetus to put huge groups of people into these exercises and have everything right. You've got this incredible trend of counselling that's come into the world in the last 10 or 15 years. Counselling got sort of men and women in white coats running after anybody who stubs their toe. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit cynical, but that's the attitude of my generation. But I recall two things that I think might interest you in terms of how times change. There was one ambassador whom I know rather well, who was involved in an earthquake. And in the course of this earthquake, there were two Australians in a hotel on the 7th floor. Well, the hotel collapsed. Now, one Australian was stone dead as a result of it, but the second walked out, totally alert and prepared to face the day, although a certain amount of shock set in. Well, he went up to the residence, and there wasn't any question of counselling. But the way he was treated, he was given a double scotch and 2 Valiums and sent to bed for 3 hours. The second example is another case where a head of mission was involved in a town where there were extensive riots, and as a result of it, very large numbers of people were evacuated through the airport, and there were large numbers of foreign nationals, planes coming in. And as always in these circumstances, whatever nationality you belong to, there's a lot of whinging and moaning about whichever embassy you belong to. Cases of moan, whinge, I wasn't treated well enough, and all the rest. Well, this particular complaint was put to the head of mission at the airport, that so-and-so said that the embassy hadn't moved quickly enough on transport to the airport or something, to which I think the extremely ill-tempered head of mission at the time replied, "That's bullshit." Now, the result was that the headline was not the complaint, it was the response. So the embassy's case got priority over the complaint, which actually was a pretty good result. But I don't think that's the advice that would be given to heads of mission in this day and age. The other point that I must say, this issue of sport and diplomacy that Stuart raised interested me a lot in India, and I'll get back to that a little later. But I think there's one thing that does stick in my mind, and that's the remark he made about Kim Jong-un bringing in Dennis Rodman as a North Korean attempt at displaying soft power or public diplomacy, call it what you will. And you will recall that Dennis Rodman was an African-American. Most basketball players are in the United States, but I just want to mention that. Well, shortly after he brought him in, they sat watching a basketball game together. A photograph went round the internet of Kim Jong-un pointing to Rodman a couple of seats in front and talking to a very worried-looking North Korean general, and you would understand any North Korean general would be worried, and saying, "Are you telling me that's not Obama?" So it can work against you. Getting down to the more serious points that came out of the day. Look, I just really wanted to highlight four or five things that really occurred to me just listening to people today. And if I don't mention individual comments or individual input, some of which was very good, it's not an allusion to, it's not catching my attention, it's just the things that particularly came on my mind, perhaps because things I've been dwelling on recently, I don't know what. First of all, having Peter Varghese talk this morning in this particular theatre really brought back my days when I was with Bill Fisher was one, Miles Cooper very close to being the same year. When we were all sort of green and very, really boys, because when you're 22 or 23, 45 years ago, you're a lot younger than people of the same age now in many respects. Anyway, the secretary then was Jim Plimsoll, and he was, a truly unusual man. He was quaint in many ways and different in many ways, but he was a true Australian intellectual as well as a policy formulator, and he really sought to develop Australian foreign policy and really had worldwide respect for his thinking. He wasn't always treated well by the politicians. In fact, he was treated very badly later in his career. But he was, I think, of the civil servants I've seen in foreign affairs, who had also the rank and standing to project his thinking. He was the best until I think Peter Varghese came along. There have been many different secretaries and everybody has different aptitude. But in terms of capacity to think through foreign policy issues and having the standing to project them and get them across into the community, I don't think there's been anybody since Plimsoll that matches Peter. So I think really we're very lucky to have him. And one thing I regret, quite honestly, with this government, I don't think they've got the absorptive capacity to really grasp what a very valuable asset they have and use the sort of thinking that he has and he has been able to redevelop in this department to the national interest. Okay, that's the first point I want to make. But it also underlines the importance of a foreign policy establishment of maintaining the capacity to think. And this becomes all the more important if you think that one of the major things that any foreign policy establishment has to do is deal with change. How does a country deal with change? And as change accelerates, as it has been in the last 20 or 30 years, this becomes all the more demanding, not only in terms of how you operate as a foreign service, but in terms of the multifold challenges you have in this period of globalization. And that's something that any embassy will tell you about. Anybody who was in an embassy 40 years ago and is an embassy now will tell you how much the whole agenda has widened and the greater speed with which you have to act. That's really the subject of an entirely different dissertation, a new dissertation, but it is very different. Change, capacity to think, and he has that capacity. The second point, I think, that really came up a little bit in his speech, but it also came up with others during the day. And this is the importance of persuasion in foreign policy. We've moved away from a term which was extremely current about 10 or 15 years ago in this department, which I disliked and I never used, and it was advocacy. And what advocacy? Advocacy is a barrister. It's arguing a case in the court. It's putting a number of points across, and it's important in its own context. But what it envisaged in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade was getting a list of talking points sent to you from Canberra and boring the hell out of anybody you could find, reading them out in the country in which you were accredited. Now, that's an entirely different discipline, which at times has its place, no question, to persuasion. That is something which often can take days, months, to really bring people around to your point of view, to your particular argument, either on a particular issue or much more generally about the case you are making as a country. And that brings in to this whole issue of diplomacy, and I think this was very much, hit on by Bill and Ramesh. And this is the point of really diplomacy, to a very considerable degree, is about people. You can't lose sight of it. The really good heads of mission are very, very careful with people, how they deal with them. They watch them, they persuade them. They attempt to make friends, even though it's temporary. It can be done. So it's the people side of diplomacy, even between heads of government, really is crucial. Don't lose sight of it. You can't do it in talking points. You can't do it in briefs. And I think real politicians, real diplomats understand that. Apparatchiks don't. And there are plenty of apparatchiks around, believe you me. Okay. You don't, in our embassies, hear bad stuff. Not in the national interest. Long-term, poor. Okay. So just remember that. People really matter. And I remember thinking, recently in terms of negotiations, I heard really a very good speaker once say that there were 2 or 3 things that really mattered in negotiations. One was trust, even if you had to build trust by guarantees, of course. The second was face. You had to bear in mind how the other guy would come out of an issue. Absolutely crucial. Look at those Iranian negotiations. 2 crucial aspects up there were, above all, trust. They had to get some form of trust to walk away. Secondly, face. The Americans had to persuade this very, very difficult domestic audience. The Iranians had something of the same. They had to be able to say, we won. Okay, I think the third thing you have to bear in mind is timing. But the point comes down to so much of that is to do with the personal relationship between 2 people, or 2 groups of people. Brings me to the next point, this whole question of public diplomacy, which we've talked about. Look, there is one overwhelming, I say this all the time, so some of you may have heard it, and so I don't want to bore you, I'll be quick. There is one overwhelming factor which makes the challenge for Australian diplomacy simply different to any other Western democracy. It is that our countries of first foreign policy priority, with the exception of the United States, which is sui generis, are all countries with a culture which is different to our own. That is a different situation to other countries like us. It's different to the Canadians, it's different to the British, it's different to the Dutch, for example. And that really makes the challenge of diplomacy very, very different. And it means the need to persuade other publics and institutions doesn't become less important or just as important. It's a lot more important to show these other countries what our society is about, with the hope that there will be a greater receptivity to our policies and ideas as a result of that. So rather than actually spending a ridiculously low amounts on public diplomacy, ridiculously low amounts, by comparison with the Europeans or the Canadians, we're just way behind the game, and I don't. That point's already been made. The point I really want to make is that it's a particularly important issue for us because of this cultural factor, and I talk about culture, of course, in the widest sense: history, ethnicity, religion, no colonial experience, at least in the way that it is commonly understood. All those factors, hugely important. And that, I think, having made that point about the cultural difference, I think all the points about public diplomacy really follow from that. So there's no point, I think, adding much to what's already been said, other than that I agree. Okay, look, I think that's enough. Everybody gets kind of tired at 5:30 any night, particularly on a Friday night. I actually had to get up pretty early to drive up here from Sydney. That's one of the problems, one of the disadvantages of not living in Canberra. And so, look, having said that, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and it's always a great pleasure to be involved in AIIA events, and I'll be sorry when I leave this particular position, but all good things must end. Anyway, thanks very much.